Good evening, everyone. My name is Firoza Godrej, and I am a board member of the Asia Society India Center. Asia Society's programs across our 14 centers are now virtual and global. We have hosted more than 600 programs during this lockdown, including some very interesting discussions on art, public health, and world politics. They're all available on our YouTube page, so do go ahead and view these webinars whenever you have the time. The Asia Society India Center wanted to end this rather tumultuous year on a positive note. So for our final webinar, we are delighted to host a conversation between film historian and media theorist Debashree Mukherjee and acclaimed journalist and writer Sidharth Bhatia around Debashree's exciting new book, Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, brought out by Columbia University Press and Penguin Random House. The book is an expansive study of early Indian cinema, looking at the transition from silent to talkie films from the 1920s to the 1940s. It locates the history of Bombay films within a history of India itself, pre-independence, and moves beyond a singular analysis of films and film stars to reveal a much broader network of people, ideas, and modes of production that constitute our film world. Importantly, it deals with the less glamorous and often ignored side of filmmaking, its economics, technologies, labor, and politics. In the conversation this evening, our panelists will surely unpack some of the ideas that Debashree has placed in her path-breaking book. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce both our esteemed panelists and speakers. Dr. Debashree Mukherjee is an assistant professor at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. Her first book, Bombay Hustle, presents a practice-oriented history of the consolidation of the Bombay film industry in the 1930s. Welcome, Debashree. Sidharth Bhatia, a close friend of the Asia Society India Center, is founder-editor of The Wire and author of several books. He writes regularly on culture and politics. My final point is a bit of housekeeping before we proceed. We will end the session with an audience interaction. So all those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. For our audience on Facebook, please drop them in the comments section. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Sidharth Bhatia will refer to a list of questions and select relevant ideas for both speakers to respond to. I would now like to invite Debashree to begin the session with a presentation around the making of the book. Please enjoy this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Firoza, for that lovely introduction. I really want to first thank the Asia Society and Ketki Verma for inviting me to do this at the end of a very difficult year. But it's very heartening to feel like there's an audience for this book in Bombay, which is a city that really inspired this whole research. And it's a real deep privilege for me to be having this conversation with Sidharth Bhatia, right, whose work speaks for itself. And I remember every time I met with people in Bombay trying to kind of parse or excavate their family film histories, they would always say, oh, do you know that Sidharth Bhatia is working on this thing? And I remember specifically talking to Sushila Rani Patel when you were working on the Babura Patel book. So this is very, very special. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and just introduce some of the key points of the book and how I came to this. So let me just enable screen share. Okay. Okay. So Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, narrates a history of Bombay cinema as a history of material practice, production, and work, very specifically looking at a formative period in the life of the Bombay film industry, the talkie transition of the 1930s. I show how cinema, during this very turbulent time in the life of India, extended into every area of urban life. Yet, the screen is only one part of a dense ecology of things and people that mutually constitute cinema. Cinema exceeds the content on the film screen and embraces a density of embodied cultural techniques that are predicated on a future image, but that take place long before the final film product even reaches the theater. I argue that the work of ideating, acting, writing, dancing, stitching, lighting, or simply waiting on the sets in preparation for a shot are equal parts of the history of cinema and should be very central to our understanding of local productions of modernity. As different bodies pushed a camera trolley, adjusted the focus of a lens, or mixed pigment powders to match an actress's skin tone, they also crafted fresh imaginations of who they were and what they could be. In the process, cinema altered the city, and a new historical figure came into being, the Cine Worker. The Cine Worker's experience of the self as worker is an embodied intuition that the modern world is deeply wrapped up with the techno-industrial at the same time as the body extends into and folds within itself the many complexities of space, time, and environment. But let us rewind a little bit. Before I was trained as a film historian and theorist, I was trained as a filmmaker. From 2004 to 2007, I worked full-time in Mumbai's film and TV industries as an assistant director for films and even a camera person for a reality TV show. I was freelancing from job to job, moving from apartment to apartment. I was struggling to keep up with rent increases and following very sincerely the injunction to be creative that Angela Mukherjee has so powerfully analyzed in this book from 2016. Now, during these years, I frequently had the intuition that my work and my city were uncannily intertwined. Returning home in an auto late at night, a street corner that would be awash in yellow tungsten light suddenly would feel like a film set. The sound of the rain clattering on the roof of the edit studio would feel like the very definition of Bombay. Or waiting at Churchgate Station for the fast train to Borivali, I would catch myself humming film songs that articulated my subconscious emotions. In moments like these, cinema and the city merged into one, and bodily affects very seamlessly move between these worlds of film and life. So thinking with lived experiences like my own and of the very many historical protagonists that I have encountered in the archive over now more than 10 years of research, I now think of Bombay cinema as what I call a cine-ecology, where bodies, institutions, technologies, and environments collectively shape the production and the circulation of cinematic meaning. Cine-ecologies emerge out of the very energetic entanglement of practices, symbols, infrastructures, ideologies, people, and climates that swirl around the film image in locations where filmmaking and film consumption are prominent aspects of everyday life. So a cine-ecology is very much tied to its time and its place, even as it is caught up in many translocal relations. One of the central arguments of Bombay Hustle is that cinema responded to and shaped urban transformation, not only through on-screen fantasies and images of modernity, but also through the very material presence and circulation of a varied and a very visible cinematic workforce. So cinema's status as the foremost kind of cultural engine of desire and imagination in the 20th century has to be understood, according to me, along both these axes of representation and the image, as well as work and production. So by tracking multiple practitioners and laboring bodies within an ecology of cinematic practices, we start to gain new understandings of what were the conditions that made a local film industry even possible. Now, the analytic of a cine-ecology gives me a very dynamic and inclusive framework that can accommodate the fact that a cinema is also situated in its immediate environment, but also that it is a very relational thing. What this means for Bombay cinema is that the filmic creation, right, is a product of many different relations and forces. A film industry is shaped by its proximity to other industries, right? Communications industries, the cotton industry. Bombay cinema owes a lot to production in other film centers, and these are some of the very significant film production centers in the 1930s. And that cinema also draws on many other media forms, such as the gramophone, the radio, theater, literature, print, and so on. So cinema is a continually shape-shifting medium, and Bombay cinema exceeds the perimeters of simply the mapped city. So I just want to take up a word from the book's title, Hustle. To hustle means to move swiftly and hurriedly, or to kind of compel someone else to move rapidly. So to jostle and push. So starting with this basic dictionary definition, hustle was very helpful for me to think very carefully about the labors of the working body and the desires of the working self. It also allowed me to move between different kinds of scales. So in the book, I have two parts. The first part is very much a kind of a macro view of the industry, its financing, its kind of scientific organizational efforts. And part two is very much a kind of a micro view of the very intimate kind of work of the body that is film production. So in the book, you will meet a film fan, for example, who is eagerly awaiting the big break. You will meet junior artists who patiently wait their turn outside a film studio. You will meet producer entrepreneurs who anticipate future profits through a series of calculated risks. Each of these figures for me, right, from a clapper boy to an extra, to the producers, to a stunt artist, to a camera person, each of these persons for me is located in very different temporalities. They are part of a very different kind of location and hierarchies, but they are all equally half turned towards the future. But this is a kind of an idea that's implicit in the word hustle for me. That is, hustle is a kind of a temporality, to always be looking towards the future and making a gamble on the future. It's a form of speculative action from a site of immediate vulnerability. So just to wrap up, hustle is also for me a practice of the imagination. I have explicitly positioned this book as a book about how our imaginations materially produced, right? Projections and speculations, gambits and fantasies. What is the material work, the labor, the technology, the apparatus that goes into making these images and imaginations that have sustained a whole world of viewers and makers in their shared journey through modernity? The making of fiction films involves the invention of stories that will be filmed, as well as the invention of stories that one practitioner will tell another practitioner in order to maintain and perpetuate a fundamentally speculative enterprise. So through a history of cinema and its makers, we start to understand the many stories that constitute the everyday and our ideas of the real. And some of these ideas and stories include creativity as consciousness, production as progress, accident as exception. And I try to kind of dismantle some of these ideas in the book. What these many stories signify for all material purposes is that the hustle goes on. Or in the words of one of the characters that you will meet in the book, struggle jari hai. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
That provides, as you provide, a nice overview of the book and of the framework you brought to it. but now I think the viewers will be eager to know some of your 10 years of research you mentioned. So clearly that's a lot to talk about. Firstly, many of the things you did say, and I have gone through most of the book. We carried a review also. I've read other reviews. Many of the ideas you said are really relevant or applicable to many other parts of cinematic history of the last 100 years. Why did you choose the era from 1920s to 1940s? And don't you think that there are any other era, if you had picked up, it would have been equally relevant in some ways?
So that's an excellent question. Continually while writing the book and researching it, I was very struck by the similarities, right? Even with the conditions of production and the experience of filmmaking, or even the experience of being in Bombay as a filmmaker, as a film practitioner today. The reason that I went back to this moment is because it's a very particularly interesting transitional moment. So I'm looking at the late 20s to the mid 40s, because this is when we see a technological transition to talkie cinema. And because of this technological transition, it really gives a big boost to the Bombay film industry. And we have many narratives for why that happened. One of the most well-known narratives is that Bombay filmmakers chose to make films in Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani, right? Whereas in Calcutta, they chose to make films in Bengali, which then limited perhaps the audience base. So I was trying to think about what are the many other reasons why Bombay became this kind of preeminent production center in South Asia. And also I wanted to look at the time and place in which some of the templates for what popular cinema in Bombay is today, when those templates emerged, right? Where some of those kind of ideas for narrative, for image making, and even work practices, what time at which it started to emerge. So this is the time for me when a lot of this, we can trace back a lot of the present kind of practices and aesthetics to this moment. So I wanted to look at a certain kind of a moment of transition where things start to kind of crystallize into the way that we recognize today.
Yeah, I'll come to the Bombay part later because your book is Bombay Hustle. It is about Bombay. And as you've rightly said, that many of these things came together, including the use of language, which was not a language that this city, which belonged to this city in a manner of speaking. But first, that must have been the period most difficult to research. I mean, firstly, in the film industry, Indians themselves are not very particular about storing archives. The Hindi film industry is notorious for not keeping its own archives. There are institutions, there are private collections, yes, but that must have been the most difficult part. How did you go about it?
So that is the most difficult part. So there was two layers of difficulty, right? So one, this was not designed to be a project about film analysis or studying film images or interpreting film stories. From the outset, this was going to be a history and a study of film practice, right? Film labor, production techniques, and so on. Now, that kind of work is difficult under any circumstances, right? And so that kind of exacerbated the historical archival problem. Because number one, as you would well know, but maybe perhaps everyone in the audience doesn't, out of all the films, and many films made, hundreds of films made in this early talkie period, right, between 1920 and 1940, say, at least 95% of those films are considered lost today, which means that we are resigned to believing that we may never watch 95% of that hugely productive output of those years, which means we have a very, very limited, less than 5% of the pool of films made at that time to look at, to study. And they come to represent all of this other lost kind of missing archive. So the films themselves are missing. So how much more difficult it then becomes to try and track the practices of the making of those films. So I had to be very kind of inventive with trying to think a bit outside the box about where to look. This is also the 1930s, so I couldn't even hope to even meet any surviving practitioners, because it's their children and their grandchildren that I was able to meet. And I see some people here. Hi, George. George Worshing is here. The grandson of Joseph Worshing, a very important German cinematographer who immigrated to India and made it his home. So there were many methods I used. One of them was to kind of try and meet and track families to see if there were any stories, any materials, any papers, any photographs that they had. Then I looked at autobiographies and memoirs. And then I found that if one looks for the history of film, like a history of celluloid at this moment, in archives of paper, you find a whole profusion of things. So to look at newspapers, to look at reviews, film magazines, and that very wonderful thing called the song booklet, which any historian of Indian film will find a treasure. Because a film booklet is basically like a book. It'll have a poster cover on the cover, and inside it'll carry the synopsis of the film in multiple languages. It'll carry the cast and crew credits. It'll sometimes have still images from the film, and it will have song lyrics, which is the main attraction of the booklet. So song booklet gives you a lot of information about films themselves that are lost. So yeah, I had to look in many, many directions. One of my most important archives was in Australia, in Melbourne, preserved by Peter Dietz, who is the grandson of Himanshu Rai. And Devika Rani, Himanshu Rai's wife, had preserved a lot of studio papers, letters, correspondence, contracts, screenplay fragments from the 1930s, which is absolutely unprecedented for that time period. We do not have that kind of studio paperwork in the Indian context. If you're studying Hollywood history, for example, there are MGM archives and Fox archives and just all these rich archives where you could spend a decade. But in India, we actually, unfortunately, have not focused much on preservation, conservation. So I had to do a lot of kind of sideways creative thinking and use many different methods to try and approach this history.
So one of the things about Bombay at any time in its history, but certainly at that time because of various reasons, and certainly by the end of the 1940s as partition was coming closer, was the sheer number of migrants into the city. And while there were enough people working out of this city, there were also coming from the hinterland, because there was already a film industry in Kolhapur and Pune, from West Bengal, Pakistan, that to be Pakistan. So that was one very, how much of the fact of migration, which is really the basis for the history of this city, did play into your ideas?
So obviously it was a very, very central question. One cannot understand the history of Bombay city, right, without acknowledging that this city is a city of migrants, that if the city now has a reputation of being a city of opportunity, of financial opportunity, of cultural diversity, it's because, right, it attracted so many different kinds of people from all across the subcontinent, but even beyond the subcontinent, right, who were attracted by many, many advantages in the city. And those reasons also made it a very viable location for a fledgling kind of film industrial form, which was considered a very taboo cultural form, right? So it needed a particular kind of individual with a particular kind of an imagination of themselves and their work to be able to counter all of those taboos and say, actually, I really believe that this is a form of that could either give me a lot of profits, or it could give me an opportunity for creative self-expression, or it could allow me a showcase for my musical talents, whatever it is, right? So this question of history of migration is very important. This is a time before partition, but this is a time when this Bombay city is really consolidating as a kind of a financial, creative, and a political hub. And that attracts, it becomes a magnet for many kinds of people then moving to the city. It's textile mills, right? It's cotton textile industry is its kind of main engine. And that attracts thousands of mill workers. So, and mill workers become some of Bombay cinema's earliest audiences, right? So if you think about who are the people that really enabled this industry to kind of become this Bollywood thing that it is today, you cannot ignore the fact that a lot of paisas and rupees were paid initially by mill workers who thronged to this form, which was cheap, right? Cheaper than any other form of entertainment available at the time, and really kind of contributed to the creation of the film industry and its capital assets.
The film industry was a taboo field. That opens up so much more in terms of where we can go from here. And the most manifested part of the most important part of that taboo was women joining, right? So, for example, Dadasaheb Phalke for his early films had to get men dressed up as women, which was also the norm in theatre for a long time. But then you see a very interesting development over that 25 year period. First come the non-mainstream minority heroines, Jews, Anglo-Indians, and then come a whole period in which there were these highly educated Maharashtrian Brahmin women. Only then it goes towards, say, other communities, including Muslims. So really, the ideas of modernity may well have fed into this idea of the industry being kosher as.
Yeah, so one of the things that kind of a through lines in the book is to think about some of the many changes that are happening at a macro level that are being orchestrated by some of the main kind of stakeholders of the film industry, from financiers to producers to distributors, who are all very, very interested in obviously making this a viable, enduring industrial form, which will be able to make reliable kind of profits. But in order to do that, they were also very interested in making this a respectable form. Right? So this question of how can cinema become respectable, right? How can middle class, bhadralok audiences embrace this form? Because it's not literature, it's not theater, right? It's some kind of mass form that mill workers are interested in. Now that becomes a question for these big stakeholders, this cultural respectability question. And they tackle that question at many levels. So one of the reasons for the taboo is the kinds of women, right? The kinds of constituencies that become the employees of this early phase. And a lot of kind of moralistic kind of judgment about women from professional performing backgrounds, women from courtesan backgrounds, women that have sung on the gramophone, for example. Now, this is obviously a huge dilemma and a paradox, because sound has now become, right, a possibility for this new film. And one of the main attractions of the sound film is speaking and singing. And you need singers for this new form. And where are you going to get ready-made adult singers who can play your lead heroines? They have to have been trained in music. So there's this kind of push and pull where you have to employ, right, women that are trained in song and dance. But at the same time, you have to make these very public, for me, very performative gestures saying, we are not like that, right? So, which is why I look at a very interesting kind of a subgenre of film that emerges in the 1930s, which I call the Barrister Films. There are these two films, the Barrister Films and the Abhinetri Films. And these films are dramatizing this problem, right? So they are about women. Their main heroines in the fiction films are actresses. And the main plot is about how Samaj or society is not accepting these women. And the film's whole plot is about proving that so what if she is an actress? She is a hardworking person, she is skilled at her job, and she deserves a right to be accepted by society, right? So for me, it's very interesting that the films being made are doing a kind of, also for me, a kind of a social argument, right? Saying that these women also have a right to work, because it's such a fraught question. So for me, that's the film actress is a very, very important figure through the book. And one of the hustles in the book for me is this huge hustle of the actress to kind of claim a right to work, and a right to work with some claim to respectability, legibility, safety, dignity. So that's definitely very, very important. And while there is a push to hire more Hindu, Brahmin, married, college-educated women, definitely in this time period, the playing field is still very diverse. And a lot of people are changing their names. So if you're just looking at the names of women and they sound like Sita Devi or something or the other, that is not an indication, right, of their caste, class, religious, or other background. So there is still a lot of diversity, I think, in this moment of necessity, because you need trained people and for various other reasons.
But this brings up the question of how cinema, at least in the Bombay context, but perhaps elsewhere too, was a great promoter of the idea of cosmopolitanism, was a great, gave a great impetus to the notion of modern ideas. You mentioned barrister and actress films, but there were also films showing career women, telephone girl, typist, doctor, wife, even in Marathi, and the idea that women can be career-minded, though of course a lot of them towards the end start arguing that her real place is at home, she cannot neglect it. But still the idea of, because soon after that, by the 50s, working women are out in the field, in offices. So modernity for me and the idea of the Bombay cosmopolitan, the Bombay modern and the Bombay cosmopolitan, is certainly cinema has done a lot to promote that idea.
Mm-hmm. So I think you're absolutely right. For me, this is happening at two levels, right? So of course, cinema through the images on screen is circulating some images of what the modern self could be, right? It's also creating all these aspirations. And often one needs a kind of a place like a cultural text to even open up your mind to imagine that, okay, I could try and be this other thing, that there might be a different horizon of possibility for myself. I'm also interested, alongside looking at those images, at what it meant to be working in filmmaking, right? Which also circulates certain ideas of the modern. So how to think yourself, imagine yourself as a film practitioner, to imagine yourself as an actress, right? Imagine yourself as a film director, imagine yourself as a dialogue writer. None of these are work profiles that have existed before. These are brand new possibilities, right? So to even be able to inhabit that space, that I am going to be an actress, I'm going to Bombay to write dialogues for films, that is also part of this great production of this modernity, which is very central to Bombay's history, and Bombay's kind of resonant status. In terms of the actual films themselves, so the Barrister film that I mentioned, the important qualifier there is that it's the lady barrister film. So these films, right, feature women as lawyers. And often the plot is such that at the climax of the film, a female lawyer or a lady barrister is defending another woman, most often a woman from another generation, most often her own mother, because they've been separated and they are going to reunite in the courtroom because that mother was not educated and might have been a courtesan. And she was banished by society and so on and so forth. So there are numerous films like this where you see these two images in the same frame. This college-educated, often Oxford-educated lady barrister, right, coming back from England, defending her mother, who's from a different generation, from a more feudal kind of a past. And cinema's trying to accommodate both these visions at the same time. And that to me is very, very exciting. Because something changes, right? This sounds often to many people like Avara. So where we see Nargis as Rita in the courtroom as a lady barrister. But Avara is very centrally about Judge Raghunath and Raj. It's about the father and the son. In this moment, there's something else happening, and it's often about mothers and daughters.
Well, just to mention it as a subplot, as it were, the same thing happens in the 60s in Mamta, which was originally made in Bengal, where the daughter defends the. So I think we were still coping with developing modernity around that time. You know, one of the Bombay parts of the book, which actually for me, because I hadn't come across any substantial discussion on this, barring Bombay Talkies, which of course, as everyone knows, was a public limited company and set up by industrialists financing it and buying and becoming shareholders. But the fact that you talk about film financing, which comes from speculation and speculative activities. So if they have just taken a gamble in the stock market or the cotton trade or cotton futures, they might as well put some of the profit in this, because this also could, so it's not born out of necessarily conviction, but as another arena. And that is establishing that link is what I found really very, very fascinating in your book. So if you could just develop on that.
So it's interesting. I thought that most people would be bored by all the following the money kind of nitty-gritties, but it is surprisingly the chapter that most people are really appreciating. For me, it was an initial simple question, right? But you're trying to think about a whole kind of ecology of production. What are the conditions that make a kind of industry and a cultural form possible? One of the first questions you have is, where is the money coming from, right? And we know, and if you look at some of the most kind of authoritative texts that are available for us, which are actually products of colonial inquiry committees. So the Indian Cinematograph Committee report of the 1920s, and then the post-independence, right, Indian government's film seminar report from 1950. Now, between 1920 and 1950, a colonial and a post-colonial government, in their surveys of the film industry, will say one thing: this is a hugely undercapitalized industry. It has faced a lot of financial neglect. It has very poor infrastructure. Its methods are very improvised. And yet, for some reason, right, it goes on and it gets stronger and stronger. So I was thinking about, if there are no institutional formal channels of finance, banks are not funding films in the 30s, and well, we know that they weren't funding films till very recently. The government doesn't care about the film industry, right? The colonial government is only interested in censoring film content because it could be a nationalist or anti-colonial. So where are they going to get money from? So a lot of money is coming in from a gray economy, from a speculative economy. And part of the reason is because in the 1930s, the colonial government is clamping down in a very kind of aggressive way against certain forms of cotton-based speculation. So the cotton futures market is being surveilled very vehemently by the colonial government, even while other forms of speculation are taking place, which have the benefit of being called corporate. So I'm trying to also draw out this kind of binary, which is a false binary, between corporate forms of gambling and indigenous local forms of gambling, and the colonial government clamping down on one. So where is that money going to go? And because the colonial government doesn't really care two figs about the film industry in its production avatar, it becomes a very good kind of a channel for moving a lot of cash, which it's a gamble. You could make 10 times a profit if that film works out, or you could lose all that money if the film bombs. But these are people, these investors, who are very attuned to that risk. And they're very they embrace that risk, right? Because if there's an off chance that you could recoup 50 times, sure, I'll do it. So that became very interesting for me to think. And then I was like, okay, let me try and actually find more evidence. And you can see, if you just look, there are traces everywhere. Mill owners are investing in films, right? Some of the earliest kinds of, and this is across studios. And one of the most colorful characters in the book is Chandulal Shah, who is the co-founder of Ranjit Movietone, one of the biggest studios that India has ever seen. It was a hit-making machine, right? And not one film from that studio exists for us to watch today. So a huge, huge tragedy. But Chandulal Shah was a major gambler. And he would put a lot of his money from cotton gambling and from horse racing into his films. So this studio that was making maybe like 3 hit films a year never really had the money for solid assets, because they were constantly moving the cash between these different markets. So very, very fascinating kind of history.
You mentioned Chandulal Shah, Debashree. He was, of course, also promoting his own favorite heroine at that time, I think. And so also later the Jalans were involved in the film industry. They're also big mill owners. So yes, do you think they were also influencing the subject matter or the thematic content or the politics and the social politics of the films they were financing?
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. One of my first kind of entries into this project was because I happened to pick up in a bookstore, I think in Breach Candy. I don't know what I was doing in Breach Candy. This was many years ago. And I found a translation of text by Saadat Hasan Manto. And these were those Bombay stories. And I just couldn't believe it. I used to work in film at the time as an assistant director. And I found someone writing about filmmaking and the world of filmmakers in the 1930s and 40s in a way that for me was very ethnographic. So Manto says at some points, right, that in these stories, that he feels that the only reason that he was hired, right, was to add some kind of prestige of a literary writer to some very formulaic stories that these producers wanted, because they knew they would just be surefire hits, or they kind of followed a certain kind of formula. So there is definitely a push by the producers, but the producers actually don't know much about filmmaking, about story writing. And so that there emerges a kind of a whole generation of specialists. So I talk also about how specialization starts to become a thing, because some of the earliest filmmakers like Chandulal Shah would write their own scripts, right? Would coach the dialogues, would direct, would also co-produce. So they were multitasking. But eventually you had specialist writers, specialist dialogue writers, screenplay writers, and so on. So there isn't so much of a direct kind of dictate that in order to make profits, the subjects will be like this. In fact, there's that same gambling mentality that you see that in Ranjit Movie Tone's films, that let's hedge our bets. Let's make one mythological film, one historical film, one modern social film, and, and one rural film, one urban film, and let's see what sticks, right? Because this is a very formative period. And there is no kind of a sense yet of what genre is most appealing to people. So the subjects are quite varied.
And in fact, the writers are also quite varied because, of course, the famous stories about people writing on the spot, the scripts being, there is a kind of loose, informal way of making the film. Premchand comes and leaves after one film, ironically on mill workers. Going on strike. Manto comes in. There were a whole lot of other famous writers who were to become famous many, many years later, literary people. And that actually continued for a long time. And then when music comes, you find some really fine, talented people come. So did you see by the mid-40s that Bombay's position had become preeminent? Because Pune and Kolhapur had more or less wound up. Lahore was soon to be wound up once partition came, and droves of filmmakers from another pioneering city, Calcutta, were moving toward this direction. So was that the making of Bombay's preeminent position?
So for me, it's this early talkie period. So I think by the late 1930s. So by 1939, 1940, it becomes kind of clear. So if you were kind of an industry observer, it would be clear to you by 1939 that Bombay has become the preeminent site of production for many reasons. And one of the markers of that preeminence was it had the most number of functioning studios. It had the highest density of film theaters. So Bombay also in this time was its biggest kind of revenue earner. So a lot of the profits from Bombay films were being recouped in the Bombay region because that's where the maximum number of theaters were. And films would travel very slowly at a very staggered pace from the city of production to, say, the Calcutta market or the Madras market or something else. So this definitely happens by the 1930s, which is why it was very interesting for me to look at this time period. And I think the question of the screenwriters is very interesting. We all know that in the 1940s, the progressive writers movement, right, is really at its heyday. And a lot of leftist literary writers now come to Bombay and take up film as their kind of day job, right? Manto is definitely one of those people. But it's also very interesting to look at a decade before the progressive writers, where we have a whole kind of range of people who write, say, Gujarati short stories or the Gujarati modern novel. You have people that are writing Bengali stories. So a part of the kind of literary modern movement, which is happening in many languages across the country, and it's all kind of converging in Bombay, where there are imaginations from multiple languages. K.M. Munshi was the Home Minister of Bombay, also a writer, who wrote that story that you referenced, Dr. Madhurika. Now, it's about a woman who's a doctor, but it ends in the most awful, conservative way, where she has to give up her career because she's neglecting her husband. And you can't obviously find fulfillment as a woman unless you are really looking after your husband. Now, but alongside that, we also have...
There's also Ismat Chugtai around that time.
No, but before Ismat Chugtai, there is Jaddan Bai, Nargis's mom, right? Now, Jaddan Bai comes to Bombay as a 40-year-old woman, right, with 2 children and one very supportive husband. But she has made a lot of money as a singer already in Calcutta. So she sets up her own film company, Sangeet Movie Tone. She writes her own screenplays, which are all heroine-centric, female-centric films, many Abhinetri films. She composes the music for her films. She sings the songs in the films, and she also acts in these roles, right, which are of grown women with grown children, because that's who she is. So there's a whole generation of writers, of women that we have not heard of, and we believe could not have existed, but they're there. And I think it's very, very exciting also to inspire us today, to kind of imagine that we have this very rich kind of a history that we have inherited.
I was quite fascinated by your account of Saraswati Devi and her sister, both Parsi sisters, who had to face the ire of their community, of the conservatives. But they went ahead and created some fabulous music. She was, and the other one was a singer-actress, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So it's not as if one community was more progressive or the other was not. It was just everywhere. I mean, the Maharashtrians had these women like Shanta Apte or Durga Kote or Sneprabha Pradhan. And everybody was participating. I've always enjoyed the notion of, women taking the lead and defying obvious, on many occasions is one very nice narrative. But just the idea that a whole, as you call it, ecology was developing, where there was a lot of push and shove to try and get into it and do the best. There's somebody who's asked a question here. I'm going to preempt that because it leads me as a nice roundup about what you've been discussing. That's Manisha has brought up this interesting question. There is, of course, a film center at Bangalore and Hyderabad, big center, Chennai, and now West Bengal is, kind of re-emerging. But there's this move to try and build an alternate film universe in Uttar Pradesh. I think there have to be certain conditions available, apart from just giving land or setting up technology or wooing a few filmmakers to come. Is it possible to recreate a Bombay?
So obviously that's impossible. And one of the things is this Hastinapur? Is this going to be a new city called Hastinapur, where Yogi Adityanath is going to build this new film city? I mean, all power to him, right? Let there be 1 million film production centers across the country. It's all great. But I think a narrative about opposition, right, that this is going to replace Bombay and so on, that is obviously impossible. We're also seeing so many changes today with streaming, with OTT. We really don't know what the future is going to look like in terms of, like sites of production. Maybe there'll be a possibility for more dispersed kinds of production. But the story that I'm telling in this book is that Bombay City and Bombay cinema cannot be extricated. They are fundamentally entangled. And they're fundamentally entangled because the same conditions that led to the possibility of Bombay as we know it also enabled Bombay cinema as we know it. So the same kind of cosmopolitan culture, the same mix of peoples. This is the port city. There's a lot of international traffic moving through the city. It's a city that has a space for sailors and sex workers, for merchants and princes, right? All of that Marine Drive in the reclamation, so many different kinds of people that were buying plots and living in apartments along Marine Drive during the reclamation drive. Jaddan Bai had a house there, right? Someone who used to be a courtesan, someone who feels very keenly that society shuns her, alongside a prince, right, who's also buying property, trying to cash in on the speculative boom. So this kind of possibility as a city of finance, a city of work, a city of hustle, it's a very unique combination of things that creates a very particular kind of film form, which cannot be replicated. Something else will happen somewhere else, and it will look different. But yeah, you cannot take cinema out of the city, even if film production stops.
Yes, well, I think that will be music to a lot of ears, especially this. Now, I think we'll reach our question answer time, but I'll just ask you on a personal note, you must be pretty exhausted after 10 years of work, and then of course the writing, and then getting it vetted, and then getting, we all know the process, and it's exhausting. So meanwhile, holding your day job as a teacher, is there another book already humming in your mind and on the page?
So there is another book already humming, but the pandemic has made it so that I wasn't able to, because this whole book has been so much about, for me, the research part is everything, and for which I actually visit a lot of archives across the world in order to just see if there are clues and traces. So that was not exhausting for me. That's what really kept it alive. It's interesting you mentioned exhaustion, because exhaustion is a very important idea in the book. Because one of the things I was trying to think about is, what does it mean to do film work? What does it feel like for the body, right? And how is it different perhaps from other kinds of work? And there were a few things that I tried to think with in the book. One was exhaustion, and one was waiting. Anyone that's ever worked on a film or been on a film set, right, understands how important it is to wait. So much of the work of making films is waiting outside the vanity van, right, for someone to change their costume, waiting on set for the lighting to finish, waiting to be called while someone else finishes their part of the job. So those, I think, ideas are very useful. But there is another book. I'm very interested in thinking, because for me, thinking Bombay Hustle was not about thinking about a closed city. It was about thinking about the relations of one city with many other cities around it, its hinterland, and also abroad. So Bombay was also in the 1930s connected in many ways to Berlin, to various other kind of centers. So I want to just take that forward, and I'm very interested in thinking about India's earliest diasporic audiences in this early formative period, people that are second or third generation of indentured migrants. So I'm very interested in thinking about what is the relation between Bombay cinema and some of the earliest Indian film foreign audiences in places like Mauritius, South Africa, and Fiji. So again, it'll be difficult, but I'll try.
But lovely travel. Now, there is an interesting question here from Tushna Thaplial. Could you elaborate further on censorship during the colonial government? And if I recall reading somewhere, and I think you mentioned it, as long as it was not overtly nationalistic, they didn't particularly interfere. Is that correct?
So the thing that I point out in the book is that colonial interference was mainly focused on one aspect of the entire film ecology, which was censorship. So that was the main thing that the colonial government was interested in surveilling, content. So is this possibly nationalistic? Is there any reference here to someone that's a key nationalist figure? So films would be censored because a character looks very much like Mahatma Gandhi. Right? So if you see a character who's bald, who's holding a cane, who's wearing a dhoti, is very skinny, the colonial censor might say, okay, wait, that's a reference to Gandhi, that's an incitement, we get those scenes out. So censorship is a very interesting thing at this point. We know that films are being censored then, as they are even now, because people think of certain films causing religious offense. So that's a very important petition that constantly comes to the colonial censors, that this film is offending this religious community and so on. The colonial censors are interested in films that are nationalistic or have some nationalistic messaging. So a lot of films at this time start to do very coded kind of messaging. So where there'll be a theme that will be anti-authoritarian or anti-tyranny or pro-democracy, but it would be played out not using, say, British colonizer and Indian nationalists, but various other forms. It could be a zamindar and a kisan or something else. There's one strain of censorship that I found that people haven't really talked about, and I have an article on it. It's the censorship of the film Mill, which was written by Premchand, as Sidharth mentioned, and directed by a very interesting filmmaker called Mohan Bhavnani. Mill had a series, like 5-year-long censorship saga. And it was part of a certain moment in this colonial period where there was a lot of anxiety about communism, that the leftist activists, right, that are organizing major strikes in Bombay and that are organizing with various internationalist solidarities that are anti-imperial solidarities across the world. So a lot of clampdown now in Bombay about so-called communistic films, films that show any kind of empathy to factory workers, to those that are oppressed by capital. So a very interesting thing happening at that time around the films perceived as leftist.
So there is a Hillary song, sorry if I mispronounce, was written from China. It's a long question, but I'll just read the one part. Some of those points you have mentioned. Is how do you fill some of the voids in your archive? Now you're an academic, or anybody really can't, extrapolate all the time. So how do you connect dots from the meager amount of material you had?
So I have not made any attempts in the book to just make some kind of wild leaps of the imagination. I have tried to, the main, I think, work of the historian when you're working with a very slim and fragile set of clues and archives is interpretation, right? So all history is a work of interpretation. All history writing comes from the place and the politics of the person that's writing that history, right? That makes me feel more attracted to one piece of information over another. But there is actually, once you start kind of digging deeply, and once you get a sense of what the archive is, you can start adding more constituents to the archive, right? So things that you would not have thought of before. So one very interesting place that I found where I could find actual historical evidence of things that I was looking for, like I was looking for women's work in this time, and I wasn't finding it anywhere. And I started looking at police cases. And there is the continual kind of overwhelming instances of actresses being involved in police cases and court cases that get reported in a certain kind of court archives and in newspapers. Why, right? So, and they're almost always about breach of contract. So that gives me a very interesting insight into the status of the actress in this time. One of the main kind of industrial kind of struggles where producers are trying to hold on to their biggest asset, the actress. This is definitely a time where it's the reign is of the female actor, and then all these legal ways in which to discipline an actress who wants to perhaps start freelancing, because this is also a time when they're all salaried employees. So you're getting 500 rupees a month, which is a lot of money, but even if you make 10 hit films, you cannot negotiate a raise. So there are some very unusual places where one can find that kind of evidence. And if you look at there's 1/3 of the book is just notes, the footnotes, the endnotes, where I really kind of show you which are the sources from which I'm drawing some of these conclusions.
So we can take only one or two questions quickly. One is caste networks. This has come from anonymous attendee who says, what are the caste networks that laid the foundation? I think this is a very interesting question because there were caste and religious networks or community networks really, which may have emerged or facilitated some of the filmmaking of the time.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great question, and it's one of those questions that one obviously cannot avoid, especially when we are thinking about Indian industry and Indian cinema, right? Because of the peculiarities of our social context, where there are so many different kinds of cleavages and nuances of caste, class, religion, gender politics. So one of the useful things about looking at the 1930s, right, when these film companies are just starting to kind of consolidate themselves, is to really think about, which is what I've tried to do in chapter 1, think about who are the constituents, who are the key players here, where is the money coming from, who are the producers, who are the directors, who are the actors. And you start to see, for example, Ranjit Movie Tone. I look at Ranjit Movie Tone, I look at Sagar Movie Tone, look at Bombay Talkies. Now, Bombay Talkies is set up by a group of upper caste Bengalis who are foreign educated. Their main language is English, maybe some German, French thrown in, but definitely they're trying to learn Hindi once they start making films in Bombay. And because of that initial kind of community and caste group, they are constantly also, when they're looking actively for actors, talent, technicians, it's through their personal networks. So when I went to the Deets archive and I saw the letters of Devika Rani, she's writing to her Bodhi, her sister-in-law in Calcutta, saying, if you hear of any good story writer, can you please recommend? We are looking for a screenwriter. Now, those then become willy-nilly, right, a kind of self-selection. So the family member will recommend another family member or someone that they read in their language, right? So this stuff starts to happen. There's the Gujarati studio, there's the Bengali studio, there's the Punjabis over here. So that has a very strong kind of an imprint.
Maharashtrian, because
and of course Maharashtrians. There's a lot of, so like Naresh Fernandez has done so much work on the earliest musicians, right? So Goan musicians, Konkani actresses, and apart from the top tier of people that are starting the studios, different vocational profiles start to have a history of certain vocational communities joining those works. So just like in the millworking textile industry, there were some parts of the cotton manufacturing process that was assumed that some castes would do, right? Because they would invite their friends and relatives from the village and say, we want these people to kind of join. That started to happen in Bombay too. But to actually parse that question, to kind of do a demographic-based division of different vocations and communities, that will need a whole other order of research. And I haven't found much evidence to really say very clearly that the carpenters all came from this community or the makeup persons all came from this community. But it starts to happen. I think if you do ethnography today in Bombay, you'll be able to perhaps see that more clearly.
Okay, last quick question and quick answer, because I think this. Aradhana Seth says, what do you think, what do you feel are the production, design, art direction, symbols, objects that throw light on that period? And I think certainly the sets would be a very critical part. I've often looked at films from the 30s to the 50s period, and it's full of fantastic Art Deco furniture. So anything you want to add or elaborate on?
So it's just such a great question. There is just so many other projects that I want to do. And one would definitely be to think about production design in this time period. So this is also the era of studio production. So there's a lot of work happening indoors, and there's some fabulous kind of built sets that are being made. There's a book that I'm editing that will be coming out next year, which is about the films and some of the amazing production stills that you saw in the presentation that belong to the photo archive of Joseph Wershing, who was a German cinematographer who worked at Bombay Talkies. Now, through some visual clues like that, you start to see what work went into the construction of sets and so on. There's some fantastic things there. So one thing that blew my mind, just for example, is there was one photograph which was clearly taken during the filming of Bombay Talkies' first film called Jawani Ki Hawa, a 1935 film. Majority of that film, and I've watched that film exists. Majority of that film takes place inside a train. Right. So it's a very kind of limited space. So a whole train compartment set was built inside at the studio floor. And those of you that are in Bombay will know that the Bombay Talkies ruins still exist in Malad. And if you go there, you'll stumble upon it. But they, instead of back projection, Like, so when you have a shot of a person sitting and this in a train and the scenery is moving behind, often in that time in Hollywood or Germany, you would do back projection. So you would play a film that would keep moving. Instead, what Bombay Talkies did is they had a round drum-like cylinder with painted sceneries, and it was a mechanical thing. That whole cylinder would move to keep changing the scenery. So I have never seen that kind of contraption and that technique in any other film industry of that time. So there are many things there, including the Art Deco furniture, the most gorgeous saris, right, from Bauhaus designs to I don't know what. So there's a lot to be done about thinking about fashion, costume, set design, production, and this kind of a whole world of aesthetics in these films.
Okay, well, excuse me. We've gone slightly over time, but I think there are questions galore here. So I think at some stage they could send them to you if you want to answer them.
Yeah, I would love to maybe see if these questions could be saved.
Yeah, no, I think they'll be able to. But Debashree, thank you very much. Of course, thank you, Asia Society, for bringing us together on this. But your book is certainly, as I said, creating some waves among film aficionados. And of course, Bombay, people who are crazy about Bombay, which is in the millions, as you probably realize. And I think this connection...
Sorry, I just want to quickly say that it's really exciting for me because this is it's an academic book. I have tried to make it as readable as I can, but it still remains, it's not a popular history. So it's very exciting for me that people in Bombay, people that are interested in film, people that maybe work in film, would enjoy parts of the book.
Well, I must say it is tough going in certain parts, but thank you so much for this wonderful thing. I think this goes on to YouTube, so people can look at it and perhaps pick up the book and read it. I saw a couple of questions about people saying they picked up the book. So yes, of course, writers are going to plug their book. It's also published in a more affordable edition in Bombay. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience, for joining us. It was quite the tour of the city at that time and the growing industry and how it emerged. And thank you, Asia Society, for setting this up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.